Greetings, friends. Wantingruska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian update for the weeks of July 20th through August 3rd of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day, and we're going to start in the Dobropillya direction. We haven't started here in a while, and it looks like the Russians have restarted their offensive operations to take the city, the town of Dobropillya, during the campaigning season, and they are starved to a very strong start. Now, before we've always talked about them nibbling around Bilytske, nibbling, around Drishny for like the last couple months. We never really, Dobropillya was always the last thing we talked about usually. But no, not this week. This week there's been a massive, in terms of like a bit of a breakthrough here. And let's talk about it and let's see what happened. So, for about a little over a week ago, we talked about how well, we didn't talk about it but last week Bilytske fell, which was very big. They were nibbling around this. They were entering maybe the outskirts of it. But the Ukrainians always held up in the more built-up western section, and but suddenly the Russians overcame and were raising their flags in Bilytske. So that was a big change. I was like, well, why how did the Bilytske fall? So after being nibbled over. Around the same time, we also got news that Shenchenko had fallen, and I always thought maybe they would how would they move from across these fields to Shenchenko because of the drones, but it does seem like they did take Shenchenko. But not only that, then within this week, in the last week of July and such, we started seeing that the Russians not captured the towns of Svitle and Vodanskia. And we had, for example, we had geolocation of the Russians raising their flags in Vodansky even. And so, yeah, I mean, these are two very, as you can see, good built-up towns that are essential for the Russians to accumulate forces so that they could then, move forward towards Dobropillya. Not only that, as we can see on our map here, we see that now I haven't seen a geolocation of this, but Syriac is a neutral mapper, and he shows this that, for example, this mining shaft, which belongs to the town of Chernivka, has been taken by the Russians, which is the biggest built-up area. Everything else in Chernivka is just a bunch of residential areas. So but I do build because I always thought once they took Bilytske, they would attack to try to take this mine shaft, which looks like they did, and then they would swoop across, take the rest of Chernivka, and then swoop down to take Vodansky and Svitle. But it looks like they kind of did a two-pronged attack. Took Shemchenko, Svitle, and as you can see, the gray zone, they pushed the gray zone all the way up to the small Dobropillya to the south of the real Dobropillya. Um, so and that's so it could be that I definitely think this kind of shows, maybe DRG activity. Maybe the Russians are active here, but maybe they have not consolidated here just as of yet. But I will expect that probably by the end of maybe within a week, next time we talk, I'm pretty certain the Russians will probably have captured, something like this, and probably the battle for Dobropillya will officially begin. Though it probably already has. We could probably actually say the battle for Dobropillya has begun for this area. So now there's been a lot of questions about how did these defenses fall so rapidly, because there's been barely any movement here, and then suddenly there's a ton of movement. So why is that happening? Some sources are saying that the new commander in chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, General Drapy, he apparently withdrew the forces to Dobropillya to have a better defense line. That's what the Ukrainians are saying. I don't buy that because these are Bilytske, these are strong fortifications. They weren't being surrounded here in any sort of it wasn't like they were in some big cauldron or whatever. They were in a good position to keep on fighting. There was no reason for them to withdraw. Now, what I believe is that after the Russians took Konstantinovka, they redeployed. Remember there was a bit after Konstantinovka fell in what was it, late May, beginning of June. There was like a 2-3 weeks where there was like kind of a pause, and what was happening is they were rotating people and sending a bunch of their assault forces, in my opinion, to the Dobropillya direction. Now, this is where the main action is, in my opinion. Or at least the kind of the focal point of the action. And now now the assaults on, we'll talk about this later, but now the assaults towards Alexandria Driskovka is now a secondary direction. But it seems like the Russians are now putting their main efforts on Dobropillya. The other thing that I could buy, but is that, for example, they said that one of the main defenders of the Dobropillya direction, the first Azov Brigade, which was kind of deployed in this area, was taken to start the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Dnipropetrovsk area, and that's why one of the main defend and the Ukrainians have been pulling defenders from Dobropillya because after Pokrovsk fell and they realized they didn't have to fight, they've been putting them to Konstantinovka, putting them in places where the Russians were fighting for this year, and because Dobropillya was so quiet, there's been less and less forces here. Um, so it does seem like this is maybe they did pull it, but I'm not 100% certain of that. So yeah, that's the very so yeah, that's the Russians will continue sweeping through these villages to the south here. The Russians will break into I actually I'm interested to see how fast Dobropillya will fall. I do think that the Russians will well, let's talk about it in a second. So, and then the other thing I want to talk about in the Dobropillya direction is that, as the battle for Dobropillya has begun. Now, I think we talked about this last week, but more and more mappers have basically confirmed this, that there's a bunch of DRG Russian activity that's breaking through into Dobropillya. Mostly, they've been saying they've been breaking into the town of Ganivka here, and this is interesting because they kind of swarm through all these areas to reach here because it cuts off one of the main logistics hubs to Kramatorsk. Now, this is the main logistics hubs from the western side to Dobropillya, which is still active. But again, a lot of drones are not going to be targeting this one road, which will be a very bad news for the Ukrainians here. So, yeah, and also we've had more saying that the Russians are entering kind of this eastern part, this residential area, Dobropillya here. So I haven't seen any videos of it just yet, but a lot of mappers and people who have sources on the ground are saying it's the case. So there's a lot of interesting things happening here, and so, how will the battle for Dobropillya go? Will they, consolidate in Ganivka, and then, start moving across here? Will they consolidate, push, through here? That's two ways of doing it. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of built-up areas. This is the, for example, this is the kind of the industrial built-up area, the central part of Dobropillya. Now, what for example, when Battle for Konstantinovka was ongoing, I was like saying, well, they're gonna try to bypass the built-up areas, but it seems like maybe like they'll just attack it head on, and because I always thought that maybe this is where the main, but they kind of sweep through the built-up areas of Konstantinovka pretty well. The way the Ukrainians have it is that they have less and less infantry, and there's not like there doesn't seem to be a lot of like actual people just holding the line here. It seems like there's less and less of that, and the Ukrainians are trying to for example, they might have drone operators in Bilytske here, for example. And, they're sending drone operators to try to pick off Russians who are trying to move towards the Dobropillya, but, they don't, there's not a lot of actually infantry trying to hold the line. That's why, for example, when the Russians were outside the fields of Konstantinovka, they were being struck by drones, but once they entered Konstantinovka, there was barely any Ukrainian soldiers there there was some, I'm not saying there's nobody, but it's not like every single building here is occupied. It's not as, and so I actually think that once they do enter Dobropillya and consolidate or manage to have like a way to send troops there pretty easily, especially since they can knock out any drone operators that are in Dobropillya, that way they're able to, they have to push the drone operators back to Bilytske here, and if they could push them back there, it's a lot easier to approach Dobropillya because it takes longer for the drone operators to, reach wherever you're trying to enter Dobropillya from, and then especially once you enter Dobropillya, then you could just hide in the residential area, and then so I do think that there's a very, very good chance that Dobropillya is captured in terms of this war pretty quickly, maybe by the end of September. So, also, as the Russians have claimed, they have the towns of Stepi and Vilnia, and these dachas right here. Again, this area right here is this giant field, so I don't think obviously, remember there's this breakthrough that happened here that the Russians entered Zolotokoldasky, remember last year. So I don't know. I do think the Russians will want to take this area because this helps protect their flank. Because then the Ukrainians in Zolotoye Kolodasky could then try to attack the Russians here. But I do think that maybe again, this is why you don't want to just slowly take, because the flanks are just a bunch of villages that are out in the fields and you're struck by a lot. So the only reason you would you would move it on the flanks so you could put your drone operators at, so then you could cut off the supplies to the main defense, and then you could attack it directly. So, honestly, this is what I would do. I wouldn't even focus on, people are saying like, oh, you need to take this area first, and then you need to like kind of push towards this river here, which kind of saddles around the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. And then once you do that, then you can encircle Dobropillya, and then but you actually don't have to physically encircle things. The thing is, drones kind of took over that. So basically, you just need to basically just advance enough where you could put your drone operators so that they could then cut off the main roads to the main base here, and then you would just take what you need, what's the minimum to take, so that you could move through these built up areas and then enter the main city, which is where you want to enter. And then once you take over the main city, then you could, clear out the rest. So that might be what they might do. But I do think for certain that once they, even if they do focus on Dobropillya first, is that they will eventually take, these area too. Because the main reason I think for Dobropillya, and then I think also towards Bilytske, is that the main reason for this is to be able to advance further north to envelop Drusovka from the west here, just as they're advancing to Drusovka from the south and east here. And so, they're kind of, the battle for Dobropillya is a prelude to the battle for Drusovka, which will probably start happening sometime in the winter of 2026, 2027 here. So that's what I think is happening in the Dobropillya area. And yeah, that's it for that area. So yeah, the battle for Dobropillya has begun. There's a lot of interest. There's a breakthrough here. So we shall see how that develops. Was that just a small, like, was that a bad rotate? Like, did they rotate people out and forget to put someone in? This was just a localized breakthrough, and the Ukrainians are going to send forces to slow this down. We shall see. So, but very good news for the Russians in the Dobropillya direction. Everywhere else in this area, apparently the Russians are slowly but surely trying to reach Sergiyevka, but just kind of around here. But we don't know. But besides that, they haven't actually reached it yet. Dobropillya is nothing interesting happening there. I'm gonna add this as part of the Dobropillya direction because it is kind of like could go for both. But anyway, another interesting thing that's happening here is that the Russians actually hate this. Before this, I thought so as you can see, there's like this Kerensky-Terezk river here. So I thought, okay, the Russians took Sofievka and Terezka. These are good towns and then I thought that stopped because I'm like, why, everything else is just fields. I don't think they would have done that, but it seems like there's actually been some local a breakthrough here where the Russians have before, they had, last time we talked, they were in the towns of Pavlovka, Novopavlovka. I thought like, okay, maybe those are DRG activities and whatnot, but no, actually there's been this expansive offensive here, and they took the town of Pryutia, Krasny Kut, Torskoye, Toretska, especially Torskoye, which is actually a pretty good decent sized town, so they could accumulate troops here, hide them in the basements and all that. And as you can see, the mappers here are showing more and more of these fields being taken as under Russian control. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't, not this video, but I think I mentioned before that everything in these fields, there's like nothing. There's not like Ukrainian troops hiding in these tree lines, and I don't think there's Russian troops here. I think this is just like, I think maybe there's like some Ukrainians in Mykolaivka, maybe a handful, but that's it. Maybe using drones here and whatnot. But besides that, I think the main defense is kind of right here. You could kind of see it in Nova Mykolaivka, Nova Igorivka. You could see the trench systems, I believe. Let's see if you can, or maybe not. But anyway, there's like a big trench system in Rasky, in Nova Igorivka. As you can see, there's also the Kerensky-Terezk River that separates them. So maybe the Russians continue pushing toward Petrovka, Rasky, but they will have to now push, cross the river and try to start entering these areas. Which maybe it's a prelude to, as the Russians are trying to enter, this kind of area, the Russians will also try to enter this area. So, very interesting. As you can see, this is all connected with, with Dobropillya having to taking it will help support the battle for Drusovka here. So lots and lots of interesting things happening. But I do think that kind of the main goal, probably for the Russians, is to take something like this, and maybe take Bilytske, but that might be a bit much. But yeah, definitely that Bilytske will be on the chopping block as well soon. But you can see once they take this, and by that time the Russians will have taken Alexander Druskovka as well, and maybe even this area right here. As you can see from here, then they could then start attacking Druskovka. And then the main goal for like kind of the winter campaign will probably be Druskovka and Bilytske. So then, by the time we get to, and then, there'll be a radical slowdown in operations. But by the time, what I'll expect through the beginning of like the end of the spring campaign, the beginning of the summer of 2027 is that they'll probably try to clear up Bilytske and Druzhkovka. That's kind of my prediction. So by the time the kind of the main campaigning season starts for the summer, for example, we'll see Bilytske and Druzhkovka being the main areas of focus, and then from here, as you can see, once at this point, then at that point, the Russians would have probably by then taken Lyman and Mykolaivka, something like this. So as you can see, then they're going to start. The main campaigning for 2027 will be Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. I have no idea why there's like this giant fog that's taken over half of Ukraine, but we'll restart the map here to stop being gay. Stop being gay, I said. Well, there seems like there's. Oh, never mind. Anyway, I'm not sure why there's like it's acting like a complete retard. I'm literally using my. Okay, anyway, enough. But anyway, as you can see, for 2027, the main focus will be on Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. They'll try to put the squeeze on both these towns. It'll be the big bloody battle of 2027, but they will hopefully take it. And then from there, by the end of the campaigning season of 2027, the Russians, might have taken, something like this. And as you can see, only this part will be left. And then my guess is that by the end of 2027, the Russians will ask, Zelensky will then start saying, okay, if you withdraw from Sumy and Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk, we will give you the rest of this like northwestern part of Donbass. The thing is, by that point, the Russians like, well, why would we? They might give up Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk, but I do think Kharkov is way too valuable to I don't think the Russians are going to give up like Kupyansk, and then by that time in like a year's time, that I don't think they're going to give up this northeastern part of Kharkov. They're going to keep it, and but I do think like maybe Sumy and maybe like this area Dnipropetrovsk, they'd be willing to do that if they take maybe this like kind of north, this like north like this part of Donbass, which will be left after the 2027 campaign season. So, the I think the Ukrainians might give this up in exchange for maybe getting Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk back, but at that point, maybe they've taken, the Russians have, have advanced enough where, they'll, maybe they don't want to give anything up. So we shall see. But anyway, that's a lot. We're now going to go to the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk fortress city line and talk about what's happening there. Lots of interesting things. The biggest thing is also another interesting is that the battle for Alexandria-Druzhkovka has begun. I kind of mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Dobropillya, but we had geolocation, for example, the Russians being in the entrance to Alexandria-Druzhkovka here. We also, a lot of sources are saying the Russians also have like a positions in the most kind of in Osivka here. This is kind of basically part of Alexandria-Druzhkovka. So, but the Russians have entered Alexandria-Druzhkovka and are now consolidating here and are going to advance. So now, that was about a week ago. So we don't know if have they been kicked out, have been destroyed. The thing is, it's very hard to know what's what and what's going on per se. So, it's interesting to know, what's exactly happening in this area. So there's that, and but as you can see now, we're seeing that the Syriac has finally shown Dobropillya is under Russian control, which has basically always been the case here. We've I do think that they'll probably try to take Alexandria-Druzhkovka by the end of the how do you say it? By the end of the summer camp or the fall campaign, because just because summer's going to end in a month or so in Ukraine doesn't mean that there's still going to be foliage, but in September and October. But I do think that so the campaigning season will continue into the fall, but by then it will be kind of slow down. But anyway, but yeah, I do think Alexandria-Druzhkovka, because it's smaller than say Konstantinivka, and that once they do enter it, it's pretty easy to knock the Ukrainians out of here. So I do think that the Russians will try to at least take most of it and such. And another interesting thing that's actually happening is that they're actually doing that. They're kind of chewing gum and walking at the same time. Is that before I said they would have to clear out this this pocket that's to the north of Konstantinivka, but it seems like they're advancing here and also clearing this area. Now, there's probably very little Ukrainian troops here, and I don't think Ukrainians are like sending troops here because again, just as the Ukrainians have a lot of drones, the Russians have a lot of drones, and so the Ukrainians are are safe in Druzhkovka, and maybe they could send people to Alexandria-Druzhkovka, But in these, they might have some troops in like in these kind of more built up areas, but in terms of like sending them out into the fields here, it's very risky. So I do think it is like kind of big gray zone here. Maybe there is like some Ukrainians have been stuck here for months who are been hiding in a hidey hole, getting supplied through like drone drops and all that. But it seems like the Russians are slowly but surely just kind of like kicking out whoever survives here, and just, for example, a lot of sources saying that Chasiv Yar fell, but Chasiv Yar fell last year. It's kind of one of those like, what's your definition of Chasiv Yar falling? Like, for example, there's this like western district right here that I guess is part of Chasiv Yar. I thought it was part of Mykolaivka, but the Ukrainians sometimes had troops here, so a lot of people were denying that Chasiv Yar fell for such a long time. But but yeah, kind of the main part of Chasiv Yar did fall, like, last year. So, but now most mappers are saying, okay, now that Mykolaivka has been taken, so this kind of like this like residential area to the west of Chasiv Yar, and it seems like the Russians are also pushing here. They have also taken some of these built up areas around Chevron here. Um, the Russian MOD, for example, has recently announced they've taken the town of Stinky, but I do think that's mostly. I think the way they announce it is that the groups, like, they send troops there, and maybe they have two or three troops there, but then they like then they announce they take it, and that could be the case. Maybe there's like no Ukrainians here, but again, it's not. It's very hard to. There's not like when someone says they took Stinky. There's not my get. There's not like some like, oh, there's like a bunch of forces here. I do think that maybe there's like maybe two or three Russian troops that are hiding in Stinky, and there's probably no Ukrainian troops here because they're not interested in like leaving their built up areas to kind of enter these fields because of drones. So I do think that probably the Russians are just, this is like a big gray zone, and that the Russians are just slowly but surely clearing this up, and I do think they'll eventually take it. Um, on the way towards Bilytske here. So very good. The Russians are slowly but surely closing this area. So I do think Chevron and Podolsky will be cleared out very soon. But yeah, and also yeah, their battle for Alexandria has begun, and they're now actually clearing this pocket. So very good news for the Russians there. As we can see in kind of more northern part here, towards the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk area itself. Another interesting thing is that we could actually kind of say, not officially yet, but we could say so, is that the battle for Mykolaivka has begun. So a lot of lots of big important battles are starting in the second half of the campaigning season. For example, most sources are saying that there's like the Russians have entered. There's like DRG activity right, in the dachas out in the outskirts of Nikolaevka. Now, that could be the case, and I do think that is the case. But it's like, well, have they consolidated? Is this just like two or three troops there to hide? And also, Mykolaivka is a big area. I do think this is actually a big area. There's actually a lot of Ukrainian troops. And so it will be the Russians will need to find a way to slowly move through these areas and take Mykolaivka. Um, I do think the advance from the north is hampered because the battle for Lyman is still ongoing, and there's like Ukrainian troops holding on to Lyman, which, if for example if the Russians had control of Lyman up to the Seversky Donetsk River, they would move across this area, freely towards the Slavyansk power plant, and then cut off the main highway of supply towards Mykolaivka. But right now it's kind of, they have the Ukrainians onto the north that could attack them and hit their flanks. So there's that. We don't know exactly the exact positioning, but a lot of the Russian. Last time we talked about, the Russians were consolidating around the Alexandrivka, Krylovka, Nikiforivka line, just clearing out these areas behind it. This week they're expanding there. For example, they took this giant space. They took these forests right here, and so forth. So as you can see, there's a big. The Russians have consolidated, and now they're starting to enter Mykolaivka. This is we'll still see if that expands. We'll see if we get more information to see like what exactly is the status here. Have the Ukrainians kicked them out? But again, Mykolaivka is a big goal for the Russians. If they take it, it'll be a huge stepping stone towards Slavyansk. So it's a very big important news for them. And yeah, we shall see how that develops. So yeah, the battle of Mykolaivka is ongoing. My guess is they're going to try to push. We'll probably see Dobropillya fall soon, and they'll start entering the Slavyansk power station. I do think the Russians are trying to. What they're going to do is use Alexandrivka and and this giant forest to then maybe move along this forest stuff to enter there. Use Alexandrivka to maybe move, into this forested area in Nikolaivka, which I think has like dachas and all that. Yeah, like these dachas and this area, and so the Russians want to enter, these buildings and all that. So once they enter, the kind of the more built up area of Nikolaevka is this area. So this is where the main Ukrainian defense is, plus the Slavyansk power plant. This area, but everywhere else is, I don't think Ukrainians are like hiding troops in these like residential buildings, so it's easy for the Russians to enter it and so forth. So we shall see how that goes. I do think that um, the Russians will try to battle for the Slavyansk power plant. If they do take that, it will be a very, very bad news for the Ukrainians in this built-up area, and so forth. So we shall see how that goes. A bit more in the between here, the Russians are expanding their positions in this like kind of bridgehead here. It looks like the mappers are showing more and more that the Russians are taking. Actually, surprisingly, the Russian Ministry of Defense has now announced this, but they've taken this. For example, they're showing that the towns of Vasilivka and Perasharmarvka are being consolidated by the Russians. I do think this is kind of more of a gray zone, but I do think that the Russians, after consolidating in Mykolaivka and Tonivka, are now expanding their zone of control. And maybe trying to consolidate in this area, because these are small areas. But I do think kind of after they do that, I do think one of the main areas the Russians will then focus on is the town of Zaporizhia and Vasilivka Poshoya here. I do think that they're going to start being DRG activity happening in this area, because if the Russians could take this, then they have these line of villages that they can move across, and kind of these trench networks to then move into the town of Bilytske here. So that's what I think the Russians are going to do. I think the Russians are going to try to use these areas, build this kind of bridgehead here. Before, I didn't think they're going to do that. I didn't think I think they would have like not tried to move here, but who knows? Maybe they've assault things directly before that I've not seen before. So it's definitely a possibility. Anyway, I do think that once the Russians create this kind of bridgehead, they're going to then move into Bilytske and start battling for Kramatorsk. Same thing is going to happen here. I do think that in the town for Alexander Druskovka, the Russians are going to try to take Bilytske here, take this, and take something like this. And so from here, we could see them battling for Druskovka, and then once they take Druskovka, they could then start entering Kramatorsk from the south. And then obviously when they take Mykolaivka, they could then enter Slavyansk from the north here. So as you can see, there's like various entrance points that they're right now consolidating in this area, or building in this area, to start battling for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So yeah, that's the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk direction. Interesting things are happening there. Now we're going to go to the Dnipropetrovsk area, this area kind of right here, / the Zaporizhia area, which is kind of this area. So in the kind of Dnipropetrovsk area, this is where, in this kind of general area, is that there's kind of good news for the Russians and good news for the Ukrainians. Apparently, now, but even pro-Russian sources are admitting this, so I do believe this is the case, is that the Ukrainians are starting another offensive here, and they are now pushing again. What's interesting here is that they don't announce, like, apparently they're trying to do this in very good, like, silence and all that. They're not trying to announce anything, because they're thinking, their idea is that if they don't announce anything, the Russian MOD doesn't know what's happening here. And they're hoping that the group of forces east doesn't announce that they're losing villages here, so that they could get reinforced. They're hoping there's like a conspiracy of silence and all that, for example. So but for example, we don't exactly know the exact. Again, I've always said this is kind of this used to be one of my favorite parts of the area, but this turned into a giant gray zone. Now it's like complete. We don't know what exactly it's what. The main thing is that, for example, a lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians are pushing, are now are like entering these fields around like Dolinovka in this area right here, for example. And then there's another area where the Ukrainians are trying to enter Ternova and Berezova, so they're trying to advance here. As I said, the main defense is around the Berezova Vishana line here, and so remember last time we talked about how the Russians were raising their flags in Alexandrivka, Dobropillya, and so forth. Even like fuck it, let's talk about this. We also have the Russians raising their flags in Blagodakna and Kristoforivka here. But then we also had a geolocation, for example, the Ukrainians being bombed in Ternavata. So again, there's a huge gray zone here where that kind of this, I think Syriac shows this well. And generally speaking, that There's just this giant, there's interlocking positions, and that doesn't, like, for example, we might have Ukrainians do like these reconnaissance, like, infiltration tactics to enter these fields to try to enter Ternovo and Berezova, for example, maybe in Nikolaevka even, but we might even see, um, but at the same time as the Ukrainians might be trying to enter Klinivka and Dolinovka, we might still have Russian troops might be going up to Alexandrivka. So as you can see, there might be, it's just it's not even like there could be interlocking positions. There might be Russian troops in Berezova as well as Ukrainians. There might be some Russian troops in Alexandrivka still, while there might be Ukrainian troops in Vishana, and again mix and match. So it's a giant clusterfuck, and but it does seem like the Ukrainians are now pushing here and trying to, it seemed like the Russians were stabilized here, but it seems like now they're pushing here as well. It seemed like maybe the success of the Ukrainians here, where the south and that's direct where they kicked the Russians out of Ivanovka, and now there's also a gray zone here. We had geolocations of back and forth Ukrainians and Russians being in Andreevko Kotsovo. We had positions of the Russians being bombed on the western part of Vozarentka here. So, and then, there's also obviously the Russians are trying to hold on to this area right here. And we've had Ukrainian infiltrations of Pidunia, for example, but it it does show that, but the towns of Andrivka, Klitsova, and Zelona High seems like the Ukrainians are really trying to push the Russians out here. These are two really good built up towns, and so this gives them a solid bridgehead. And then what they're probably trying to do is cut the Russians off from their defenses along this the main kind of logistics defenses around Kamar, and so they're trying to make the river as like a choke off point. The thing is that this now that they've crossed the Vuchka River, they also will be choked off. But again, with the advent of drones, you could actually supply your troops pretty easily, especially since there's not like a huge army here. It's like tiny groups of people fighting. It's a battle of ants and all that. So we see a lot of things happening. But apparently there's like been a restart of the Ukrainians are trying to push here again. So my guess is that they're a lot of sources are saying they're trying to retake everything to the in Dnipropetrovsk, which gives them a lot of breathing room, but also allows them to start, which I think is also the case, is that the main kind of goal would probably be Uspenivka here, and if they could push and maybe break the Russian lines here, Kamar. If the Russians could take these two towns and all that, or the Ukrainians could take these two towns of Kamar and Uspenivka here, this would be a very, very bad news, because then this very hurts the flanks of the Russians advancing towards Orekov. The Russians need to at least keep the battles going, at least in the Vashana Berezova area, and in this area. If they could do that, their flanks are secure, but again, they need to hold on. But again, it seems like the Ukrainians are pushing here, and maybe next time I record, we'll know more about how this Ukrainian offensive here is going. But as we go kind of more towards the Zaporizhia area, this is where the Russians are pushing, and we've seen more and more geolocations of the Russians. For example, we had the Russians raising their flags in the town of Lubitska here, this village right here. So now we don't know, is this like just another area where the Russians entered and then they they just withdraw? We don't know. Like, for example, we had the Russians raising their flags in Krastovka here, for example. So again, is this just a expanded gray zone? I do think that this area is all like this area up to Ternovat and Rizadamka should probably be colored in kind of this like yellow, light blue, like light yellow color. I think this light yellow means that it's mostly under Ukrainian control, but that like Russian infiltration groups can enter it. And I do think that's the case of Rizadamka and Ternovat. I think that Russians will enter this area, but I do think that but the fact that a lot of Russian sources are even saying that the Ukrainians are entering here shows that I do think that there's like some sort of like, that, I don't think they would have done that, but if they were in control of if the Russians were in control of Ternavata, for example. So I do think that the battle for the Rizadank and Ternavata are under mostly Ukrainian control, but I do think the Russians can enter it. And I do think that if the Russians want to start pushing towards Orekov, they do need to secure their northern flank a little bit, and I would push towards Ternavata and Rizadamka and try to secure themselves here. But anyway, um, we see this also in Kopany and in Rivia. The Russians claim they took in these two villages. Um, we also saw that in Novoselivka and Gluboski here. But again, this is also a gray zone that's expanding here. So I do think that maybe the Russians could reach up to here, but then it's the Russians pushing here. So the Ukraine, there might be maybe the Ukrainians are still here, but they're getting pushed out slowly but surely. Probably maybe the opposite of what's happening here, where the Russians might be, here, but the Ukrainians are pushing. So it's again back and forth here. I do think these areas in the north here are propaganda pushes. Like for example, they might say they take Dobropillya, but again, this is the thing is you could infiltrate pretty well because there's barely any infantry here. It's mostly controlled by drones. So if you could bypass the drones, you have a good chance of taking things. So yeah, there's that. Anyway, um. But yeah, the Green Forces East is the most kind of like area where the Ukraine seem like they are pushing. It seems like maybe they detected a weakness here and are pushing here, because again, the Russians took a bunch of this area which was not built up, and so maybe the Ukrainians thought they could attack here. So, but we shall see. Um, and then more in the kind of western part of the area, the battle for Steppenhursk is still ongoing. The main area is in the northern part of Plavny, southern part of Primorska, and also in Stepan. I've had multiple videos showing the Ukrainians kind of clearing out some areas of Steppenhursk. So I do think the Russians and Ukrainians are still both interlinked in Steppenhursk. It's kind of like Kupyansk a little bit. Um, so it's a battle for supremacy of who could take over here. Also, kind of the main area is that it seems like the Russians are actually kind of improving their positions around the Malasherbiki Stepova area in these kind of fields here. I don't know how much of this is just like maybe because I don't know if there's any, the Ukrainians took back kind of this area right here, but I don't know if the Ukrainians were able to enter. But it seems like kind of this area between like the Novolinovka kind of defense and the Russian defense here, it seems like the Russians are kind of pushing them back here, which helps, maybe protect their flank as they in these like kind of tree lines as they advance in Steppenhurst, for example. So, yeah, that's going on there. Um, and that's the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk areas. I do think maybe the main goal for the Russians is to take Kharkov, but as they advance towards Kharkov, their flank is just continuously being exposed. So it's going to be very, very. It's going to be. I'm guessing to say there's probably not going to be a lot of advances here. So there's going to be a lot of back and forths in this area. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Lyman area and Kupyansk area. To be honest, in the Lyman area, there's been no real changes. We still don't know the exact. We talked about the Ukrainian counteroffensive here, and we still don't know what happened. For the last half of July, have they taken Novi, or are the Russians still in control here? Have the offensive is still ongoing, or has it been completely stopped? What's the status of Lyman? We don't know yet. We haven't really gotten more of that. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I think we had some sources saying that Lyampil has been retaken, and that now they've, it's kind of like Lyampil's been taken. These areas are kind of more of like where there could be Ukrainian infiltrations, but the Russians are mostly in control here, and then the Ukrainians are in control of this kind of forested area near Stary Caravan and Brusislavka here. But this mapper has not been updating for that, but that's just something some mappers have been saying. We know so remember we had like a bunch of geolocations of all over Yampil, so we don't know exactly what's happening here. Maybe there's still infiltrations. I don't know. So we still don't know what's the status with the Battle of Lyman. We still need more info. So same thing in this kind of Borova area. There has been not really that much changes here. So yeah, nothing really in the Lyman direction, but in the Kupyansk direction, there's been some changes. Nothing big, but some interesting changes. Um, the biggest thing is that the Russians are slowly but surely clearing out this bridgehead here. I've talked about this last week. That I do think that, for example, Glushkovka and Novosolonia. I think actually this mapper is updated showed that Novosolonia has been taken by the Russians. And that especially these like kind of dachas too, and that they show Gluskovka still, but I do think, for example, a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that Novosolonia and Glushkovka, this area right here has been taken. I think that's kind of the more what the real situation on the map is. And I think the main Ukraine defense is in the western part of Kharkov and the southern part of Kupyansk Vusanoya. I think we had another, for example, we had another maybe that was in Kupyansk. I forgot exactly, but we had another geolocation of the Russians being in this area right here. So it does show that I do this bridgehead is slowly but surely collapsing. This mapper, for example, also shows that Zaragoza has been taken by the Russians before they show that as a gray zone. It's interesting that they show that half of Novoplatovka, especially this kind of industrial zone, has been taken by the Russians. I don't. There's probably some geolocations or mappers updating here that I'm not seeing exactly because I haven't seen that. But again, this does show. The Russians claim they've taken Bukoslavka, Novoplanovka, but we also had geolocations, for example, the Ukraine's being on Novokurilovka here. So again, but it would be if the Russians are clearing this up. I do think maybe they are. It would be very very good for them to clear out Bukoslavka and Novoplanovka. So this mapper is updated showing these areas are now more of a gray zone, and Zaragoza has been taken. So again, it's a matter of what's maybe this is more intermixed and more of infiltrations, but it does. The thing is that the main goal here is Borova is a very big town, and the Ukrainians could use this to try to maybe supply their troops here, and they also have this river here, so the Ukrainians could also cross the river. So, but again, it's the Russians are slowly but surely they're focusing here, but once they clear up the northern part here, I do think they'll send their troops here to finish the job here, and then the focus from that point will be on Borova. So we shall see how that goes. But again, the main the main center of Ukraine resistance is this area right here. So if the Russians could break that, then they'll be in a very good spot. Um, Now in Kupyansk itself, we had more and more geolocations. For example, of the Russians being in the central part of Kupyansk here. Before we've mostly had them in the north. We see also that this map Syriac shows that a lot of southern part of Kupyansk is also taken by the Ukrainians. That could definitely be the case. I do think most of Kupyansk is now there's very little that is solid Ukrainian control. Maybe the Ukrainians are still in control of Morova. I'm kind of surprised the Russians haven't pushed here, though. And maybe the Ukrainians are still in mostly control, maybe the most southern part of Kupyansk, especially this built up high-rise building area. But I do think that there'll be a lot of how do you say it? The Russians will once they clear, especially since they've cleared out this eastern bank, it's gonna be a lot easier for the Russians to expand their positions in Kupiansk, which is what they're doing. And I do think kind of the main goal for the Russians is probably hold up, let me get this. Probably try to push up to here, and then have this Kupiansk bridgehead because once they take Kupiansk, and have a strong bridgehead here, which will be able to be supplied, and they won't be able to be cut off from any Ukrainian counterattack like they did last year. The Russians will then push, and they'll be linking up with the advances in the Kharkov direction, which is what's happening. All right. So that's the Kupyansk area. We shall see how that develops. Now we're going to go to the Kharkov direction, and this is actually another big area where the Russians are breaking through here. Lots and lots of big battles are happening in this direction here. Where do we get start? So the Kharkov direction. The battle for let's start here. The battle for Bilytske has begun. In fact, today on Monday, August 3rd, we actually had announcements from the Russian MOD that they took Bilytske. I don't think that's the case, but if that is the case, they would show some proof. But there was a geolocation. Now people say that this is AI, but the Russians there was like a Russian troop being here, but they said that's AI. I think there was a geolocation of the Russians being in the town of Yernokovko here, which makes sense. The Russians announced they've taken this village. They also announced they took the town of Volkovanivska here and Zaporizhia here. So, and then a few weeks before, we've seen, we had the Russians saying they've taken Ukrainska and they taken. So, according to this area, it seems like the Russians kind of reached kind of the small river that kind of flows in this direction. And then once they reached that, they started, entering Bilytske here. There was this big breakthrough. Before I never thought they would do this, but because I thought, once there's just a bunch of open fields here, and the Ukrainians would be able to pick them up. But it seems like, they just said fuck it, and they did this giant, they just pushed through here, took the town of Voronezhsky, and are now trying to outflank the Ukrainians here. If this is the case, that there's this massive offensive where there's barely any Ukrainian troops here, and then they got overrun, and then Bilytske fell. I mean, that'd be huge news for the for the Russians. So, we could see that, the Russians are slowly but surely trying to level the front like this. This would be very, very good news for them. Um, if we look a bit more to the north here, we also see that the Russians took the town, or at least they've claimed they took in the town of Zaporizhia here, and which makes sense. I think what happened is that the Russians are using their positions here to move along. There's like this line of villages that goes kind of like this, and I think that's what they're using. And this is what I mean. And not only is the battle for Bilytske happening, where the Russians are now entering, and maybe they captured it. We just don't have enough evidence. Maybe next time I go on the next update, we'll see this. But at the very least, these villages around Bilytske have been taken and are now, and the Russians are now infiltrating it, and we shall see how that develops. Yeah, so then the other thing is that besides the battle for Bilytske beginning in the Kharkov direction is that we're starting to see, if we kind of scroll out here, a encirclement happening. And so, as I mentioned before, the Russians are pushing down this area. They announced they took Zaragovka. I wouldn't be surprised within soon they'll take the town of Ivanovka. And so as you can see, they're going to village hop. Now I might be wondering, okay, maybe this is just them, just tacking down this way as they attack towards Bilytske, but that's not just the case. The Russians are now advancing in this direction here. For example, we had geolocation of the Russians being in around the town of Ivanovka here, and they just announced, I think yesterday or today, that they took the town of Utisnya here, this village, this area right here. As you can see, there's this massive breakthrough that happened in this area. And also, yeah, I think there was a geolocation of some DRGs active in the Kupani area here. So I do think what's actually, so then once you scroll out here, we see what's happening here. I do think what the Russians will be trying to do, maybe they'll advance southwards, try to take Anstania and Vodania here, and then probably try to enter, the main goal will be trying to enter the town of Kornia here. So as the Russians, advance, in this area, the Russians are now advancing down here. And as you can see, this is meant to link up, in this area. So then if you look up, you can see that this giant, the Russians are going to just continue advancing in this area, that this entire northeastern part of Kharkov will come under Russian control. So, this would be very good news. This would level the front. And the big news that will happen from there is that, once they clear out this area and once they finish battling her Bilytske here, is that I actually think they're going to advance continuously. They're going to then advance towards the town of Prilanovka here, which is a pretty decent size, this is the kind of so-called big town on the way towards Bilytske. As you can see, if you scroll down, it's a pretty decent sized town. And then the Russians will then try to link up in this area right here, kind of like that. So then this can kind of like northern part of Kharkov is taken. And then from here, I think that will be what the focus will be on for this campaign season. By the time they start trying to battle for Bilytske, it'll be kind of the winter time, I think. And so there'll be a slow, but I do think that Bilytske will be the next thing. But I think right now the focus will be here. But yeah, at that point, I do think the Russians will have their Kupyansk bridgehead secured, and they're going to start advancing kind of maybe north west here, and towards this area. We'll also see probably the Russians try to take this area and start advancing here. So the main goal will be the Russians trying to push here and put pressure on the logistics centers of Bilytske here, and the Russians will probably advance here along the Svitle Donetsk River as well, towards this area. So then the Russians, probably what the Russians are going to try to do is to take something like this. And that will be the second. So part one is, here. Part two is here. And then once they do that, I do think that once they do that, that will be where we'll probably see the offensive by the summer of 2027. I think what the Russians will probably want to do is probably take the town of Shentemko here, and then have like a Kupyansk-Shentemko defense line here, and then obviously move up against the Oska River, so they'll hopefully take Borova as well. And so this is what I think the Russians will probably want to take. So by the time they take Slovyansk-Kramatorsk in the summer of 2027, I do think the front line will probably run from Shentemko to Kupyansk and then down along the Oska River. So I do think that and then obviously it'll be running along the Svitle Donetsk River here. So this is what I think the Russians will be trying to take, because as you can see that when the Ukrainians ask the Russians to give up this part of Kharkov, for example, I don't think the Russians will do that, because that's a huge part of Kharkov, and I do think that at this, maybe the Russians will announce they'll annex Kharkov or something. Who knows? But however, at this point, this does kind of like simplify the defense, like the front line here. So the Ukrainians trying to defend once the Russians, once they reach Izum and Balakleya, the Ukrainians know that they do not want the Russians reaching here because then this cuts off Slovyansk-Kramatorsk even more. So, I do think the Ukrainians are going to try to hold on to Izum and Balakleya pretty well. But I do think that's kind of the goal for the Russians is to take this northeastern part of Kharkov, and it'd be very, very good news for them. And then a bit more here, we've had more and more. We had geolocations that there was this like localized Ukraine counteroffensive here that kind of petered out. I do think right now, what I think this area right here is more of like kind of maybe a gray zone, but I definitely think that for example, Horoslavka and Semniivka are under full Russian control now, along with Zaporizhia. Uh, this Syriac finally shows Vilcha is under full Russian control. So I do think the Russians will, once they take Bilytske, they will start advancing along these forests here, take more and more of these villages here. And we shall see how that goes. So the Russians have re-secured their flank here and are now battling for Bilytske. So very, very big good news on what's on this area. So very good. Bilytske might fall soon. They might do some mini encirclement here. So very, very good news for the Russians in the Kharkov area. Also, the battle for Kazachalopa is still ongoing, but we haven't actually had any more updates on what's happening here. It seems like the Russians are in the central part, but we don't know the exact configuration. So we shall see how that goes. So, as I mentioned before, I do think that everything on the other side of this river is being secured by the Russians, and right now the Russians are now going to be focusing on the western part of this river. But as I mentioned before, taking Kazachalopa is a very good news for the Russians, and I think at that point the Russians will try to maybe expand the front line kind of like this or something like that. That's my guess, but we shall see. I think this is just another pressure point. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Sumy direction. In the Sumy direction, we have some very interesting things as well. The biggest news in this, as the Russians are bound for the Kotatan second defense line for the Sumy area, the biggest news is the Russians have completely captured the town of Novosik. So the Russians have captured this village here. We had geolocation of the Russians being in kind of these tree lines to the south of Dnipropetrovsk. And so I actually do think that the Russians will probably enter Krovsa. While we don't have any evidence of this just yet, I do think that probably as we speak, and the Russians are starting to enter Kramatorsk here. So I do think this village will be taken very soon. As you can see, the Russians have taken Ovzhovanka earlier. The Russians are in Petroshrivka, but mostly on the outskirts here. And so a lot of sources are saying the Russians are kind of taking a lot of these tree lines up to Kotatan. And so, as I said before, the main goal for the Russians is to take Kotatan, this area right here. And then once they enter there, they want to enter. The main goal is to enter what they call the Sumy forest, this area right here, because then they'll be able to hide from Ukrainian drone operators, and then use this forest as like an area to hide their troops. So, but right now, in order to enter the forest, they have to take this kind of second defense line here, which they're slowly but surely doing. Another thing that's happening from the more eastern side is that the Russian MOD claim they took in the town of Moriska, this village right here. And the thing is that we don't know how much of that is true. How much of it is that they've entered, they sent DRGs there, and then they just claim they took it. The thing is that the Ukrainians could also send infiltration groups. Anyway, but Syriac says that that they've taken more and more. They've taken these two kind of forests on the way to Morista, and that I do think that Morista probably now is in the gray zone. So we should see how that goes. I do want to see, like, for example, the Russians announced they took in the town of Zaporizhia and Mykolaivka. We still need to have more. I think we need more, because we had a geolocation of the Ukrainians being in the southern part of Mykolaivka, not in this past 2 weeks, but a little earlier in the summer. So I want to see if the Russians are in full control here. But on the, I do think that the Russians are just kind of moving along the Sel River here, and they are trying to take Maurizia, because if they are insecure Maurizia, and the Russians are now battling here, the Russians then have another entrance into this vast forest that they can enter to hide from the drones, and then they could then move along the Sel River, cut off the Ukrainians in Staky, and then they'll be able to take this forested area to hide troops in, and kind of as you can see, the Sel River. My guess is that the Russians are going to try to battle for everything on the north of the Sel River. So here's the Sel River, and as you can see, it enters Sumy. So I do think that once the Russians take kind of this, this area right here, The Russians are going to kind of move into this forested area and move into the town Bilytske, Valavernichka, Berishka, Perserovka. I'm not pronouncing these at all, but I do think the Russians are going to try to take something like this, move along the river here, and then from here they could then use the urban built-up area, because these starting at this point, these are like the suburbs of Sumy and all that, as you can see. So this is it would be a very good area for the Russians to maybe enter Sumy from. So, uh, if that is what they want, maybe they're just trying to, because the thing is that if the Russians, for example, at this point, by the end of 2027, or not the end, but like by the end of the summer 2027, that the Russians are something like this going on, the Russians might not want to give this up. Though, maybe they are trying to take this to make this more of an attractive deal for the Ukrainians, because giving up this part of Sumy in exchange for what I talked before in the what will be left of the Donbass after they take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. It is a good trade, but it is we shall see how that goes. Anyway, and then also here in this area, the Russians have taken the farms of Mala Salavka here. These farms right here, I don't even know if these are farms. Maybe this is just a thing on the map. I do think soon they will take the town of Tosa here, and so forth. But and also they're trying to battle for the Projes to Ilonovo here. If I were the Russians, what I would do is try to maybe enter through this forest here and try to then enter Zaporizhia here, using this forest to hide from the drones. And then from Zaporizhia, you could then enter Lunova, because they kind of connect a little bit, and then you could take it. So then you could have something like this, and then we'll also have something like this, and then the main goal is trying to cut off the Ukrainians that are in Kharkov. And so it seems like the Russians are going to try to take something like this. And my guess is this is just another pressure point, and kind of the main goal for the Russians here is probably just trying to, flatten the front line. So suddenly, the international border kind of flows, and they kind of took this area right here. There's nothing really strategic here. There's a bunch of small villages that, it's hard to go by, but I think this is just another kind of pressure point to drag Ukrainian resources. Anyway. Well, that's the end of these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates. Hope you enjoyed. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.